Hello everyone, my name is Mateusz Tofilski and I would like to present you the topic ecological and social affordances in the social cognition. First, I will try to define and classify the so-called social affordances, then identify the differences in the role attributed to sociocultural conditions in the preparation of affordances, and finally embed these considerations in the context of social ontology and in the context of contemporary sociological theories. I think that the concept of affordances doesn't need a special introduction, but for the sake of order, it should be said that affordances were originally defined by James E. Gibson in Ecological Psychology. For him, the affordances of the environment are what it offers to the animal, what it provides or furnishes either for good or ill, and further on, affordances means something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementary of the animal and the environment. Those, as we can see by definition, affordances were meant to transcend the traditional dichotomy between the subjective and the objective and became central to Gibson's concept of direct perception. However, the initial vagueness of the notion of affordances and Gibson's tendency to focus on epistemological issues of the theory of perception led to a certain freedom in interpreting what affordances are, and those to disputes about their ontological status, which is present in the literature. This is also, of course, compounded by the broad context of the use of the concept of affordances, which nowadays appears not only in psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy, but also in the context of design virtual reality or the IS research. Each of the discussion on the basic controversies may be, of course, separate topic of consideration. But therefore, without even trying to develop most of them, it is worth just to mention the discussion on the nature of affordances, its normative character, as well as the discussion about their integration with anti-representationalism. I, of course, due to the topic, will be interested mainly in the social conditions of the perception of affordances, but the mentioned discussions also focus on the connection between the concept of affordances and the risk assumptions of ecological psychology. On the one hand, they are based on the faithfulness to the basic Gibson's ideas, and on the other hand, on attempts to extend them coherently, or even to detach the very category of affordances from the original context. And this heterogeneity of interpretations and concepts is also reflected in attempts to put affordances to practical use, which I think will be mentioned again at the end of this presentation. But now the notion of social affordances itself is also defined in different ways, but it usually refers to relations between the perceiver and the social environment, including primarily interpersonal relations. This category of affordances includes those pertaining to interaction with other people, their facial expressions, gestures, attitudes, or utterances. And distinguishing this type from the general set of affordances, we can, following, for example, Annika Fiebich, and define interpersonal affordances as some kind of subcategory within environmental affordances, hence the title distinction which I proposed. However, the question of the social dimension of affordances can be divided into the general issue of possible social determinants of perceiving affordances, as well as the narrow problem of affordances being part of the description of the interaction between agents. Focusing first on a more general problem, we can say that the aforementioned lack of anonymity on the subject of affordances is also evident in this context, in the context of the importance attributed to the cultural dimensions. As a matter of fact, Gibson also didn't address, once again, the issues very thoroughly and devoted only a few paragraphs to it. As Sparky's followers are concerned, on the one hand, in structuralist approach or in the group of promoters of affordances in design such as Norman or Gallagher, they emphasize the transcultural dimension of affordances and focuses on the study of human motility and functioning in the physical environment. On the other hand, for example, Harry Heft states that in the case of humans, affordances are always in some sense social affordances or cultural affordances, as Ramstead and others calls them. Ramstead dividing cultural affordances into biological and conventional. One, so the cultural factor should not be ignored in their analysis. Following this line, also Van Dijk and Rietveld arguing that in the human case, the social and the material are inextricably intertwined, and they argue that affordances are best assumed to form an ecological niche as a certain sociomateriality. What's important here in Van Dijk and Rietveld concept is the so-called skilled intentionality framework, the ability to coordinate action between multiple affordances that arises in a particular situation that an individual develops within a particular form of life. Besides, according to them, the two branches of ecological psychology dealing with the social and the natural context should be linked and not separate. Alan Coastal, to bring some order to this discussed problem, proposed a distinction between affordances in general and canonical affordances, i.e. those related to cultural artifacts and subjects to conventions and norms. And in his view, it is the lack of such a distinction, or rather the generalization of all affordances to the special case of canonical affordances, that is the source of, or the base of a great deal of misunderstanding. But at the same time, Costa also points out that the experience of even mundane object is a socialized one. On the other hand, Fiebich, drawing on the work, for example, works of Tomasello, distinguishes three basic types of affordances: sensorimotor, intentional, and institutional. Thus, they refer respectively to the physical properties of an artifact, its intentional purpose, and status that a given object occupies in the context of a particular institution. Using John Searle's languages, its language, its status function. From an evolutionary perspective, Edward Reed proposed the term field of promoted action, which refers to a group of affordances which somehow supported by a social environment that encourages an individual agent or a group of agents to enter into certain interaction with the environment. Defined in this way, the field of promoted action is distinguished from the field of free action, which simply refers to the full pool of available affordances. Picking up on this theme, it must be said that the crucial become questions about the ontogenetic development and the question about the process of enculturation that makes us able to function in shared expectancy worlds, as Ramstead and colleagues put it. For humans, the perception action system is being shaped since infancy in culturally specific ways. Fiebich, for example, also shows that social cognition performs a fundamental role in the perception of ecological affordances through social learning of what possibilities of action are offered by particular aspects of the environment, as well as what possibilities a particular agent has to use them. In the second person relationship, in the case of joint attention or joint action, according to Tomasello, We can identify sensorimotor affordances, referring to the opportunities for interaction with the environment available to each agent, and interpersonal affordances as a consequence of perceiving the other agent's subjectivity. They sometimes compose collective affordances available only collectively to members of a given group, referring to the collective agents and corresponds by this to the problem analyzed in literature, the problem about that shared intentions in an action may have the same goal but do not necessarily share common means. And for example, as in the case of musicians playing in an orchestra. Of course, the threat of the affordance reference level, which is explored widely in the context of design, for example, by Volkov and Strong, is not irrelevant here, but because of time, I must ignore it. But if we talk about interpersonal affordances, it is also necessary to take into consideration that the other person perceived as a causal agent. However, also I will not elaborate here on the problem of knowing other minds, the problem of so-called theory of mind. But according to Nick Brancaccio, I can say that this distinction between interpersonal or social and environmental affordances has even ethical consequence, since it refers to the evoked recognition of the other party to the interaction as an equal agent. In turn, a consequence of emphasizing the role of social interaction in cognition is the emerging question of the role of the social environment in forming the mind of the individual subject. Within the inactivist view and in line with, for example, psychological externalism, Miriam Kaisello, cited also by Brancaccio, distinguishes two possible answers to deduce post-problem of the self. And the self here is understood as a function that integrates and guarantees the unity of human experience. Once again, I will not elaborate on the differences between narrative and minimal self. The starting point for Caicedo here is the dichotomy of distinction and participation, which highlights the fact that the subject, being constantly influenced by others, at the same time retains its autonomy and a private universe of its own beliefs, for example. A possibility which Caicedo herself advocates is to consider the social as constitutive for the self, and thus to accept the process of individualization of the self according to the social dimension. And other option, alternative answer, is proposed, for example, by Michel Maiese, who points out that an activist theory of participatory sense making is in fact about shaping the participants of social interactions, not determining them. Hence, she argues that that the embodied self is involved in social interactions in which it can be shaped or influenced, but that it is not fully determined in the sphere of these activities, which essentially preserve the autonomy of the embodied agent. And I should mention here one caveat that that is this discussion assumed, and as you can see, an ecological and activist perspective. And of course, ecological psychology and activism have much in common, but also at least some have some controversial topics between. We've got some controversial topics between them. So, for example, Eras Escribano writes about this, and we should remember about this. And of course, I do not want to say that this distinction between these two positions somehow directly relates to the distinction I invoked at the beginning. In both approaches, if we look at the category of affordances through the prism, the social dimension of the perception is crucial. Rather, I would like to point out that following Maiese and her life-shaping thesis of selfhood, the human self is individualized at the level of the body and shaped, but not determined by the social world. For Brancaccio, this is an opportunity to clearly distinguish between social and environmental affordances, considered, as I said, in terms of ethical implication. We can also say that by supplementing this view with the mentioned distinction between sensorimotor, intentional, and institutional affordances, it refers to different levels of an agent interaction with the environment and does not reduce any of them. By way of some conclusion, I would like to draw attention to one more thing. The mentioned lack of unanimity on affordances is also visible in relating them to specific assumption of social ontology and current sociological concepts. By far, of course, I think the most frequent and intuitive seems to be linking affordances with Bourdieu's theory of habitus, if only because of the attempt to overcome the hard distinction, the hard dichotomy, subjective-objective, and the description of the formation of practice by social and symbolic structures. And it seems much more complicated here to talk about affordances in the context of critical realism proposed in literature. However, we are talking here about a naturalized version of critical realism, which is proposed especially by Tuka de Soya. He rejects Bhaskar transcendental argumentations, for example, and turns towards cognitive science and the tradition of embodiment. Although, if I know, Kaidesoya doesn't devote special space to affordances themselves, this perspective can also be seen in the idea of socio-technical structures explored by Elder Bass. Again, I obviously do not want to identify Maisie's and activist view with the discussion of about critical realism. Rather, I would like to point out that the difference in this division also runs along the lines of the role attributed to agency and structure. The desire for any use of the theory of affordances on the assumption of the ontological framework of critical realism, and even in its naturalized form, in its naturalized version, would have to go even farther, and despite the recognition of the social conditions and relational character of cognition, would require a defense of some kind of defense of the autonomy of agency of individual subject. So besides, this doesn't change the fact that matching these two perspectives, the theory of affordances and the critical realism perspective, requires answering a number of other questions that cannot be developed any further within the framework of this presentation, but it can be a point of another discussion. I mentioned this problem because it is also reflected at the level of attempts to apply category of affordances in practice, in technology and IS research. The perspective adopted in this research by, for example, Wanda Wilkowski, or by also mentioned here for Leonardi, is in line with the idea of sociomateriality and in line of avoiding separation between social cognition and non-social engagement with the environment. On the other hand, attempts to identify affordances as generative mechanism, as for example in Volkov and Strong, require following the line of critical realism. So the problem, as you can see, is broad and multi-threaded and raises many additional questions that should be asked. However, that's all I've had time for. So thanks again for your attention. Please feel free to discuss.